Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I'm a customer engineer focused on management technologies. Today's discussion is part 4 of an ongoing series focused on configuration profiles in Microsoft Intune, which of course is part of Microsoft Endpoint Manager. Today's session is our, I guess, fourth session that is really an introductory session, but this time focused on Android. So we've covered just a general introduction. We've covered a Windows introduction, an iOS, iPadOS, and macOS introduction. Here's our fourth introduction. Largely they're the same, but the point of these introductions is to show you just the different uh, capabilities, the different options, if you will, for managing the different OSs before we start into diving deeper into the various capabilities that you will see with each one. Here's our agenda. Like before, we'll talk about what the configuration profiles are, why we care, start to look at some of the requirements, walk through these a bit, and see a couple that I've set up for demo, and we'll largely be done with this introductory session and on to the more detailed stuff in part 5. So what are configuration profiles specifically? Well, as discussed in the previous session, in fact, same slide from the previous session, configuration profiles are basically settings, configurations that you care about in your enterprise that you want to deploy to devices in your enterprise, full of options, things that you can choose for each configuration. Largely, you will see an umbrella label of a type of configuration, such as device restrictions, and then under that, you will see sometimes just a few, oftentimes quite a few settings that you can pick and choose from that will be important for your environment. This is one of the top 3 places, configuration profiles, that organizations will find most likely to be an area of focus as you get started with managing devices with Intune. So why do we care about configuration profiles? Well, because I list Azure AD here. We care because as we are moving into Azure AD, that means we are translating to getting modern and really trying to take a modern approach for management. Certainly, all devices that are managed by Intune, well, I should say that differently. All devices that are enrolled in Intune will be visible in Azure Active Directory. Android devices, no different, right? Uh, Android devices, iOS devices will be registered in Azure AD. Windows devices will either be joined to or registered in Azure AD. Regardless, these devices will show up in Azure AD. They will have the benefits of being in Azure AD. Configuration profiles is one benefit that comes with being enrolled in Intune and accordingly registered in Azure AD. Configuration profiles are incredibly robust. There's a vast array of configuration options, as you will see. There's also options that are kind of what I label beyond the UI that are available through some custom configurations. Now, Android is a little bit different in the way that it's represented in the console. We'll talk through that. Not going to get into any detail other than just to show you what I'm talking about. That detail will come in some of the more targeted sessions as we go along. And then configuration profiles are targeted, are focused, just like other things in the console. So whenever Intune first was introduced, it was really easy to get confused about what setting applied to which OS, where it would be effective, and so on. Now, and for a while now, thankfully, with the Intune console, it's really easy to focus in on just what you care about for managing Android and different configurations of Android in the Intune UI, and I'll show that to you here in a bit. So what are the requirements for configuration profiles and managing those on Android? Well, certainly Intune is a requirement that needs to be in place because that will be your MDM authority and so on, right? Azure AD, as we've mentioned, the Azure AD is the identity provider for Intune, and the device will need to be present in Azure AD, right? Now, one little, I'm kind of maybe said something a minute ago, and then I had to correct it and say all devices managed by Intune will be in Azure AD, and then I corrected that to say no, all enrolled devices will be in Azure AD. Here's what I mean. right? There are some management scenarios, particularly around applications, where the device does not have to be enrolled. That's referred to as MAM. It's also in the console now called Application Protection Policy. Uh, there's a whole discussion on that, so I won't talk about it. A whole discussion of the client app series that I did. In that case, the device does not need to be enrolled at all, right? But for the vast majority of management scenarios, the device does need to be enrolled. And certainly it needs to be enrolled for configuration profiles, right? Now, one thing I'll say here, I was probably going to mention it a bit later, but I'll mention it here. There are different ways that you can enroll an Android device. There's Android Enterprise, which is what we'll focus on here. And then there's something called Android Device Administrator. So Android Device Administrator, you will still see in the console. It has been deprecated by Google. And so I'm not going to talk about it here. Largely the concepts that I will talk about here will apply to Android Enterprise, but I'm not going to spend any cycles talking about it here because it is deprecated. Then you'll see in the console in a minute that for Android Enterprise, there's several different pathways for a device to be enrolled. Work profile with BYOD, work profile, several different work profile scenarios. And you will see those broken up in the console in just a minute, but all of those fall under the Android Enterprise management. And if that isn't clear, it will be clear hopefully in a minute when you see it in the console. So how does all this work? Right? How does all this work? Well, very simply, and this is not configuration profile specific, it's really Intune and management in general specific. But what you have is you have your Intune environment where you will configure various things, right? Configuration profiles, compliance policy, whatever, right? And the vast majority of the settings that you can configure will work the way I'm going to describe. So a question often comes up or might come up, especially for customers that are accustomed to something like Configuration Manager. How exactly do devices learn about settings that have been created for them and assigned to them? Right? What's the process? Is it like Config Manager, where the client will check in on a policy cycle every hour by default? Well, yeah, it has some similarities to that, right? For all of the devices, Android, iOS, Windows, if you look at our documentation, we'll tell you that the policy check-in cycle is somewhere between 6 to 8-ish hours, really. Um, and when customers hear that, typically they think, wow, that's way too long. I need my devices to have a much more frequent check-in. Well, understood, right? So let me explain it this way. The check-in cycle that the devices run on, that 6 to 8-ish hour cycle, that's really a fail-safe. The way Intune works, in fact, if you do this in your lab and you create a deployment to or an assignment to devices, whatever the device type is, in your lab, you will notice almost certainly that device configuration or that configuration will come down to the device within minutes, usually, right? Very quickly. And so, how does that happen? Are you just lucky in that your device was very near checking in the check-in cycle, or is there something else going on? Well, there's something else going on, right? And what happens is every device type that Intune can manage, Windows devices, iOS devices, Android devices, they have the ability to plug into a notification service. So on the Windows side, that's the Windows notification service. On the iOS side, that's the Apple push notification service. On the Google side, there's a couple of different uh, notification services that are out there. Google Play is the one that, boy, it's been a long time since I've looked at it, but I believe Google Play is the one that we use with our device management. Either way, Google has their own version of a push notification service. So the way this works is when Intune has configurations that are assigned to a group of Android devices, for example, in this case, then Intune will say, look, these are assigned. These devices need to have this configuration applied to them. So what I'm going to do, Intune says, is it's going to reach out to the Google notification service. Now, this Google notification service, these Android devices will have a persistent connection to the Google notification service, just like Windows devices have a persistent connection to the Windows notification service, just like iOS devices have a persistent notification or a connection to the Apple push notification service. And so when Intune tells the Google notification service that it has uh, work pending or instructions pending for Android devices, then the Google notification service will touch those Android devices and say, there's something pending for you. You need to go check in with Intune. And so those devices will immediately then go check in with Intune. So the notification service isn't really pushing the configuration, it's pushing a request for those devices to check in. And then those devices will go check in with Intune, right? That's how it works. Very similarly, if you go into the console and you look at an Android device, or any device really, you can ask for the device to sync now. The way that works is when you say sync in the console, it sends a notification over to the Google notification service in this case, which then tells the device to go check in, right? So that 6 to 8-ish hours cycle is a fail-safe. It is not what is intended to be the primary pathway for devices to be updated, right? Okay, and then one other thing. So one aspect that we will talk about, touch on it here, we'll have a session probably dedicated to it, is the idea of custom configurations. Well, what is that, right? Well, if you look in the Intune console, this has happened. I've had many discussions with customers about this, looking in, especially earlier on, looking in the Intune console for a particular configuration that is of interest, and they didn't find it in the UI. Maybe it was there, maybe it wasn't there yet, and so they got concerned that maybe they could not use Intune to manage their devices, whatever the device type is. And that spawned an additional conversation to say, that you need to understand what is capable for management, what is supported for management by the platform, whether you see it in the Intune UI or not. The point being that there is probably always going to be some sort of tension between what is built into the native UI of Intune for configuration versus what an operating system vendor will build into their operating system that can be supported through the MDM channel. A good example of that early days, right, is a customer wanted to use Bluetooth, use Intune to configure and manage Bluetooth on their Windows devices. Well, at the time, if you looked in the Intune console, there was no ability to manage Bluetooth. There was nothing in the UI about Bluetooth. And so the concern was you can't use Intune to manage Bluetooth. Well, yeah, you can, because the Bluetooth settings were supported by the MDM component on the Windows OS. And so it was just simply a matter of using a custom configuration through Intune to be able to manage those. Well, similarly, that's true for iOS, that's true for Android. And so there's a certain smaller, honestly, set of things that you can do with Android through the custom configuration pathway, but you can. And so you will build a standard, I'll show you this, an example of this. You'll build a standard OMA URI formatted kind of configuration, very much like you would for a Windows custom config. And then you will deploy that or assign that to your devices, and then Intune will deliver that to your devices just like any other config. It is not as pretty, quote unquote, as the UI config if it's built into the UI. So if it is in the UI, yeah, use it through the UI. It's just easier, right? But if it's not in the UI, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't manage it. It really depends on if the device supports custom configuration. And again, not an attempt to get into detailed custom configuration discussion here, just to introduce some ideas of things that you'll see in a second. Okay, so all of that said, let's go through a bit of a walkthrough of this, and really quickly. And again, not going to get into any detail. The detail comes later when we start to dive deeply into some of these configs. So here's the Intune console, right? Okay, so let's jump right into configuration profiles. So if I go to devices, and I mentioned that configuration profiles, other areas for sure of the console as well, are very focused. You can stay visually connected with what you're trying to do. Here's an example, devices, right? If I go to just open up the devices tab, you'll see I have Windows and iOS and Mac OS and Android down here. So if I look at all of my devices right here, I will see every device that's in my environment, right? If I go back to devices and try to create a configuration profile, I can, no problem, right here, right? And if I go create a new one, it'll show me, first of all of them. If I go create a new one, the first thing I'll have to do is choose what operating system, right? And so from here, I'll just choose Android Enterprise. From here, I'm focused. Everything now that I see is related to Android Enterprise, but I got there by seeing a complete list of devices. If that's the way you want to go, cool. That's completely fine, right? The other way is that if you're working specifically on Android, you can just simply go to devices and say, I'm only working on Android right now. That's all I care about. And so I'm just going to choose Android, focus in at that level, and now I'm going to go into configuration profiles. So you immediately only see the configuration profiles that are for Android. If you go create a profile, then you do need to select a platform, right? Why? Because there's a couple of options for Android. There's Android Device Administrator, there's Android Enterprise. This is the one that's been deprecated by Google, so I'm not going to talk about it, though largely what I'm going to talk about will apply similarly to Android Device Administrator. But here's Android Enterprise. That is your selection if you're doing anything, hopefully, with the Android devices today. You don't want to use what's deprecated. And as I say that, there are some devices out there, like some Teams devices that I know about, that are only manageable through Android Device Administrator, but those are kind of a separate class of devices anyway, which have their uniqueness, so won't get distracted there. So if I look at Android Enterprise, now I have to choose the options that are available. And so that's on this next drop-down list where I will be able to see the choices, right? And so if I look, you'll see, first of all, let's look, OEM config. That's at the very top, right, as an option. And then notice in bold, fully managed, dedicated, and corporate-owned work profile devices. All three of those are categories under Android Enterprise. And so if your device is enrolled as a fully managed device, dedicated, or corporate-owned work profile device, then these are the options that you have available to you. If it is a personally owned work profile device, these are the options you have available to you. So the one thing to understand from here is if you have, and you may, some work profile devices that are personally owned and some work profile devices that are in this other category, and you need to configure a Wi-Fi profile, then you will need to do that exercise twice. Once for the work profile, personally owned device, and once for the work profile that is the corporate owned or fully managed or whatever category, right? So that's where we break it down and how we categorize things based on what the enrollment possibilities are for Google, right? Okay, so this is where you go, and these are your options, and very easy to configure from here. Now, again, I'm not going to go through every one of these. Again, very high level overview on this. There are some things I will demonstrate. So I have an example of a device restrictions policy. The certificates here, the PKCS certificate, imported certificate, SCAT trusted certificate, that's going to be in a dedicated session. In fact, it's already in a dedicated session. I've recorded that dedicated session before I recorded this one, actually. It's part 5 of this, where I talk about managing certificates. So in that session, I will go through creating and managing certificates on all of the OSs, Windows, iOS, Mac OS, Android. So that's the first session where we really start to dig deeply onto some of these things. Other things that we'll talk about probably in a dedicated session would be VPN configurations, Wi-Fi configurations, custom. We'll definitely talk about custom in a dedicated session, right? So, but these are the high-level options right now, right? So let me show you. I'm not going to switch the slide because I'm just going into the next slide. Now let me show you these configurations very quickly, right? So, and I haven't even assigned these. I just built these as an example. So one option is a custom configuration profile. And so I built that and an example of that, again, just to show you what I'm talking about. So if I go to properties and then look at the configuration for this, configuration settings, I'm going to edit. And this window will look very much like a Windows configuration using the standard OMA URI pathway, right? And so with this configuration, I'm actually configuring uh, a disable of copy and paste, right? That's how I configure it. And Just one example, again, not digging into it. This is what you would use if what you want in the Intune UI is not present, yet the device supports the configuration. You would use a custom configuration provider similar to this. Again, more to come. If you can use the UI, it is more friendly. And so this next example is using the UI to configure some device restrictions, right? Here. And so, of course, using the UI is a more friendly experience because it just presents you the options and you choose how you want those options configured, right? So, for device restrictions, there's a whole bunch, and this is what I mean, right? This is what I mean. You see the top level of your category, but within that category, there's a tremendous number of options, right? And so I just chose a couple. Again, not trying to get into anything in detail. I just chose to configure power settings. And here, I decided to go to lock screen after 10 minutes. On and screen on while device is plugged into AC, right? And so those settings I just picked just to show you something. And then also work profile password down here. And so I just chose some settings for work profile password randomly that I might care about, right? But there's a whole bunch under there that you need to become familiar with because that's where your settings will be. And folks, that's as far as I want to take it in this session today, right? This is, again, just introducing the topic, just getting started with the topic, and we'll dig into some of these as we go further in the series. So not really any troubleshooting tips and tricks here because we are not digging in yet. The only tip and trick that I will offer you is if you have not explored the configuration options under configuration profiles, then you need to invest the time to sit in front of the UI and play with it and really understand what you have that you can use in your environment. And then don't stop there. Go to each OS that you care about and look at what's possible with the custom configurations. Like for Windows, I know that if you look up Windows CSP, you'll find an article, or several articles actually, but a couple articles that will detail all of the Windows CSPs and that you might want and how you would go configure them and different options. Some of them you can't necessarily configure through Intune because it's not supported through Intune, but it's a good reference to be able to see what is out there, what's possible, if there's something there that you need that's not in the Intune UI. So you can pursue that, maybe make a request for a modification or whatever it is, right? But at least inform yourself. And with that, we will wrap this session and plan to dig in further in next session. So we will see you next time.